Our Bible study for this coming Sunday is Luke chapter 20, verses 9 through 19. To set the context, we need to recall that this passage in the Gospel of Luke comes right after what we refer to now as Palm Sunday. Jesus has just entered into the city of Jerusalem, followed by the crowd of people. And after entering into Jerusalem, the next day he goes to the temple and is in the temple teaching the people. And all of this has just happened after coming through Jericho en route. He has healed a blind Bartimaeus, a beggar. He has changed the life of a rich publican or tax collector known as Zacchaeus. And now he is in the city, the holy city of Jerusalem, teaching the people. And the question is asked him by the religious leaders in the temple, by what authority are you doing these things? By what authority are you doing these things? That is the question the religious leaders asked Jesus. This is the context for our passage, which is Jesus' parable of the vine growers. Jesus is teaching the people in the temple. Now, the parable that he will share with them is surrounded by a significant context where he has already been asked, by what authority are you doing these things? We need to look at something about the parable and ask this question. Who are the people who heard Jesus teaching in the temple? Some of the crowd, no doubt, were those who followed him on Palm Sunday. Some would have included the local residents, the citizens of Jerusalem. And certainly it includes his 12 disciples. And we know from the context itself, just before and the paragraph just after the parable, that the religious leaders were there. The scribes, the Pharisees, and the elders were there. And they would have recognized the reference in the Old Testament book of Isaiah that coincides and helps to instruct us concerning our understanding of what God is saying to us through Jesus' parable of the vine growers. For Isaiah the prophet in chapter 5, verses 1 through 7, gives to them the song of the vineyard, which asks this question: why, when I expected my vineyard to produce good grapes, did it produce worthless? Stinking grapes is the real meaning, the plain meaning of the Hebrew in Isaiah. The fruit was worthless. Now, in the time of Isaiah as well as in the time of Jesus, farmland was frequently owned by absentee landlords in biblical times. and tenants or sharecroppers often took care of the vineyard while the owner was gone on a long trip. And that is our passage as Jesus shares this parable. In Jesus' parable, the owner of the vineyard sent 3 servants to collect his share of the harvest. It is harvest time, and now the owner of the vineyard expects his sharecroppers to provide the share expects the sharecroppers to share the owner's due and give it to the servants whom he has sent to collect that. And what happens? The sharecroppers beat those servants and refuse to pay what was due. So the owner, giving it thought, does send one more person. He decides to send his beloved son. And when the beloved son arrives to request the share due to the owner, to his father, they kill the beloved son. Jesus then in his parable, beginning in verse 15, the second sentence, and in verse 16, asks this question to those who are listening to the parable. What, therefore, will the owner of the vineyard do to them, do to the sharecroppers? And immediately after the decision is made, in verse 16, he will come and destroy these vine growers and will give the vineyard to others. When they heard it, they said, "May it never be." And then Jesus quotes a passage that you can find in Psalm 118, 17 and 18 are the verses. But it goes on down to verse 29. The scribes and the Pharisees. Here Jesus referred to this quotation from David, also given by the prophet Isaiah in a different order. What then is this that is written? The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, but on whomever it falls, it will scatter him like dust. The scribes and the Pharisees, verse 19 then tells us that they understood correctly the parable. They understood, these religious leaders, that the owner of the vineyard was a reference to God. They understood that the vineyard represents God's chosen people, the nation of Israel. They understood that the sharecroppers were themselves, that is, the sharecroppers represented the religious leaders of Israel, the scribes, the Pharisees, the elders, the servants that were sent to collect what was due the owner, are God's messengers, such as the prophets. And of course, the beloved Son is Jesus. They understood, for they were the authorities. in all matters of law. They were the caretakers, the interpreters, they were teachers of the scriptures. They were themselves the authorities. Now let us consider the use of authority today. We must first do a word study on the word authority as it is used by Jesus. It is a word which means to have power over someone, to rule over them, to exercise control over them. In Luke chapter 20 and verse 2, Jesus responds, that is, to the question the religious leaders have focused on him when he answers, tell us, when they answer his actions, tell us what authority you are doing these things, or who is the one who gave you this authority? And Jesus refuses to answer because they refuse to answer his question. By what authority did John the Baptist do what he was doing and say what he was preaching? And when they copped out, Jesus says, neither will I tell you by what authority. And then he does an interesting thing. He tells the parable, and the parable itself answers the question of authority. Or in Luke 22 and verses 24 to 27, Jesus Christ as Lord chose to exercise his authority by being the one who serves. He is in a discussion with his disciples, who are pondering who will be the greatest among them when the kingdom of God has been established. And Jesus exercised his authority, and he chose to be one who serves. One who serves. The greatest submitted himself to the will of God, to be the suffering servant, to serve as humans by paying our debt, to serve us humans by paying our debt of sin. Jesus has chosen. I am among you as the one who serves. Jesus informs his disciples in chapter 22 of Luke, and in the paragraph that begins with verse 24 and goes to 30. I am not here to exercise my authority. I am here to serve. I am here as a servant. We know him as the suffering servant. In the Gospel of Matthew, in the Great Commission, Jesus says, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go ye. Go ye. As Jesus has exercised his authority on earth and chose the disciples and has chosen to serve us as we choose to serve him in serving others. For authority has been given to us to make a decision to go and do likewise, to serve as Jesus has served. If you want some additional information about our Christian status under Christ regarding authority, turn and read from Romans chapter 13 for more on our role as Christians regarding this matter of authority. With military rank, while I was on active duty, even as a chaplain in the Air Force, my military rank gave me authority over those with lower rank. But in contrast to that, my oath made when commissioned was my commitment to serve under the Constitution. All military personnel have taken an oath. It is an oath to serve under the Constitution. That's why we call it military service, for the purpose to protect all our citizens from all enemies, both foreign and domestic. Our daily living as Christians is to follow Christ. That's service, and that's love for all people. That's our service to God. Who or what is the center of your life? How do you use your authority as a parent, as a child, as a neighbor, as a supervisor, an educator, as a husband, or as a wife? And you can add more to your list. Take your example from Jesus. Use your authority to intentionally choose to serve. Now let us note, Jesus chose to use his authority to serve. He spoke to the religious leaders truth about themselves. Jesus' parable answered their question. In Luke chapter 20, verse 2, when they asked him by what authority you are doing these things, and who is the one who gave you this authority, Jesus answers their question when he shares the parable of the vineyard. Jesus confronted their sin, their faith in the law, in the temple, and in the religious institution. That's where their faith was. That's what they trusted. Instead of trusting in the God who gave them the promised land, whose worship is to be observed in the temple. But their trust, their faith, was in law, not in the God who gave them the law and who gave them their relationship with himself. Jesus, to the religious leaders, does a wondrous thing. He speaks to their need to be born again as one of themselves by the name of Nicodemus was informed by Jesus in the 3rd chapter of the Gospel of John. He must be born again. Your authority is given to you as a Christian to exercise your authority and choose to be like Jesus. Serve others by loving your neighbor as yourself, and that is the service that you render also unto the Lord.